name is Jess, and this is Vox Populi. Today I'm honoured to be joined by Toby. How are you finding the ARC conference so far?
I'm enjoying it. Yeah, it's great. I mean, it is kind of like, Glastonbury for the anti-woke coalition, which is nice. I mean, people have characterised it as conservative, even far right, but actually there's a pretty broad range of people here. I mean, I've met libertarians, classical liberals, even some socialists. But I think they're all united by not being woke and being on that side in the culture war. There are gender-critical feminists here, not natural allies of evangelical Christians, but they agree about it being wrong that biological women should have to compete against biological men in women's sports. So there's a kind of sense of kind of fellow feeling and camaraderie around these kind of key cultural issues. And it's great to be amongst kind of fellow culture warriors and to trade notes with them and to support each other.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like there's such a strong coalition around these groups that have all come together because they felt oppressed or suppressed by the institutions, whether that's university, work, or even, the law. And I feel like the Free Speech Union does such a good job at promoting that and supporting them. What would you say the biggest obstacles are today in terms of free speech?
Well, we do have a lot of laws on the statute books which fetter our free speech and which can be invoked to prosecute you. I think for a long time, they weren't invoked to their full extent. Even Keir Starmer, when he was Director of Public Prosecutions, I think in 2013, said that in many cases, people have said something silly on social media and could be prosecuted for it, but why waste everybody's time? Often it's just a brain fart. If they delete it and apologise, that's sufficient. But he's changed his mind about that because lots of people who had brain farts during the unrest last summer following the murder of 3 schoolgirls in Southport and said silly things on social media that they could be prosecuted for, were in fact prosecuted. I think over 100 people have been prosecuted, in some cases sent to prison, for hurty words on social media. One person was prosecuted and jailed for sharing a meme on Facebook, a meme that the Crown Prosecution Service decided was a criminal offence. So all these laws that for a long time weren't used to their full extent to fetter our free speech are now being invoked to shut down criticism of various issues which the government thinks, shouldn't be publicly discussed.
Where do you think this ideology or psychology comes from? Because as you just discussed, these laws have only just taken effect in its full roots. Why do you think, with the Axel Rudy-Kavanaugh case, for example, that the law and the institutions seem to be more obsessed about people saying mean things on Twitter compared to one of the most horrific incidents that has happened in British history?
Well, that's a really good question. I think partly, I think this government believes that they need to do more to protect good community relations, which is a kind of euphemism for race relations. And they genuinely believe, I think, that if they allow people to ventilate their anger about illegal immigration on social media and link illegal immigration to what happened in Southport. The crime wasn't committed by an illegal immigrant, but many people thought it was and innocently linked the murders with illegal immigration and got into a great deal of trouble for it. But I think they do genuinely believe that allowing people to ventilate their anger and their frustration about the current level of immigration, particularly illegal migration, that will cause social unrest. And that in the interests of preserving good community relations, good race relations, they need to shut that down. I think they're mistaken, and I think shutting it down does not improve community relations. It actually makes them worse. Better that everyone on each side is able to express how they feel and, get out there and have a good, robust, heated public discussion about it. Counter speech is the best way of dealing with a point of view that you find offensive or dangerous, rather than trying to silence the person expressing it. But that's the government we have at the moment. They think suppression, silencing, prosecuting people for saying naughty things, that's the way to preserve the peace. That's the way to preserve community relations. I think they're mistaken, but I think that's their thinking.
What do you think the role of the state should be in terms of freedom of speech? Because I think something that's quite interesting is, if I'm not mistaken, like the Free Speech Union and other organisations, they kind of use legislation like the Equality Act I forgot her name, the woman who...
Maya Forstater?
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, and her rights are protected under a protected characteristic. But that would be, like, from a libertarian perspective, that would be using the state in order to, force them to include this kind of speech into their workforce. So, and it's the same like with the university bill, with the free speech university bill. Similar with that, we're kind of encouraging using the state to promote universities to have a certain kind of speech. Do you think there's something illiberal about that in a weird way?
Yeah, we had this debate, particularly about the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act. Is it actually illiberal to have the state intervene to try and force universities to protect academic freedom and free speech on campus? And I think we concluded it's not going to happen spontaneously. I think culture is downstream from politics, downstream from the law. I mean, you can see that with the Equality Act. It's had an enormous impact on our culture. It's had an impact on every workplace in the country. It explains this kind of mushrooming of diversity training courses that everyone has to do now every year, if not every month. So I think the way to fight back against cancel culture on campus, unfortunately, is to use the law to legally protect free speech and academic freedom more robustly. We've had to fight to preserve that act because Bridget Phillipson, the new Education Secretary, as soon as she had her feet under the desk, torpedoed that act. She effectively said the remaining clauses, which were the most important clauses and hadn't been activated yet, she revoked the commencement orders, which meant those clauses wouldn't be activated. And the Free Speech Union threatened her with a judicial review. And that was proceeding when she, like a couple of days before the hearing was due to take place in the High Court, she announced in Parliament that she'd done a U-turn and was going to be implementing most of those clauses. And we're waiting now to see whether she does or not. We've adjourned our legal case, but it's still there in case she reciles on what she's now promised to do. But I think with the Equality Act, there are so few good ways of invoking the law to protect free speech that we use what we can. And what Maya Forstater succeeded in doing was getting the Employment Appeals Tribunal to rule that expressing your belief in the biological reality of sex, that's protected now by the Equality Act. So you can't be fired just for expressing your gender-critical beliefs in the workplace. To fire someone for doing that is now an unlawful form of discrimination because it's now a protected belief. Now, you can say, well, isn't it ridiculous that only some points of view should enjoy that kind of legal protection, others don't? So you can be fired, for instance, if you express your conservative beliefs in the workplace, even though you can't if you express your belief in democratic socialism. Democratic socialism is a protected belief, conservatism isn't. But I think the way forward, short of actually scrapping the Equality Act, which is politically some distance away, the way forward is to try and persuade the Employment Tribunal and the Employment Appeals Tribunal to protect more and more beliefs. So we've got a couple of cases in which we are trying to persuade the tribunal that conservatism should be a protected belief. We've got another in which we're trying to argue that a belief in free speech should be protected. And, it could be that at the end of the day, so many beliefs are protected that actually the Equality Act is one of our strongest legal guarantors of free speech.
I I think I really struggle with the Equality Act though, because again, like personally, I had to quit one of my jobs recently. I was working for a women's non-profit, and they didn't like me speaking out about the fact that immigration was impacting women, and they came from like a more pro-immigration perspective, and we had this discussion, and it was kind of like, it wasn't like they were threatening to fire me, but I could kind of tell the way. But again, like I think it should be within their rights as an organisation to hire and employ whoever they want.
Yeah.
So I do struggle with using the law with that. And just in general, in terms of having these protected characteristics and the Equality Act, I do feel like it has segregated us in a way, it has valued these identities. Obviously, as you discussed, there are some really good side effects of that in terms of protecting freedom of speech. But on the other side, you know, these trans activists, they've also used the Equality Act to promote their stuff.
Well, I mean, let me make an argument for invoking the law and asking the state to intervene to protect free speech, even if it does mean interfering in the freedom of association of a company or a group. I think the argument is that, in the not too distant past, we could rely on private companies, charities, to be fairly conservative with a small c, and to protect things like tolerance for different points of view, including people unhappy about the current levels of mass migration. But so many of those little platoons now, those companies, those organizations, have been captured by the radical progressive left, who are busy enforcing woke dogma in their workplaces, in their spaces, that we have no alternative now but to call on the law to try and protect our right to free speech, our right to dissent. And, you know, if they behaved a bit better, if they weren't all marching to the same tune, then I think that there'd be a much stronger argument for leaving them well alone and protecting them from state interference. But at the moment, you know, calling on the power of the state, invoking the law to protect our right to free speech is pretty much the only option we have.
Yeah, that's interesting. It does seem to me that the methods of Free Speech Union, I really do appreciate what you guys do. It does seem to be more of a reaction rather than being proactive with this kind of stuff. We have entered an age where everyone's incredibly dogmatic. They are, you know, people are getting persecuted for believing that there's two genders. But the Free Speech Union and other free speech organisations and activists, they are kind of reacting to that and preserving those rights rather than addressing the underlying ideology. How would you suggest that we go about addressing that underlying ideology so we don't have to, you know, have this big role of the government?
Well, I think one way in which we can challenge radical progressive ideology is in schools, in universities. I think hopefully one of the long-term impacts of the Higher Education Freedom of Speech Act, which admittedly only applies to English universities, will be people will be able to speak up more at universities. They won't be concerned that if they do dissent or challenge radical progressive ideology, that they'll end up being cancelled. And I think the Free Speech Union helps a bit too. People, I think employers, universities, tempted to cancel people for challenging critical race theory or gender identity ideology, they know that, you know, if the person is a member of the Free Speech Union, they'll be in a world of pain if they try and cancel that person. You know, we'll be on their cases, we'll be taking them to court, we'll be fighting them at every step of the way through the disciplinary process. And I think that is beginning to have an impact. I think when I set up the Free Speech Union, I did think, you know, that what the Free Speech Union would largely be doing would be changing the law to try and make speech freer, getting rid of some of these fetters on our free speech. And actually, we spend most of our time just stopping the law from getting any worse, and slightly improving things like the Online Safety Act, so they're not quite as censorious as they are in their first iteration. And that's quite depressing. I was hoping we'd be able to do more, but I hope to work with leaders of opposition parties on developing a free speech program for when they get into government, so they can immediately start restoring our right to free speech, which is so vital for our liberal democracy and something we should be proud of having developed over the past 800 years.
I have a friend who she got into trouble for saying Rule Britannia, and
I think I met her yesterday.
Yeah, she's great, and the Free Speech Union was such a massive help for her. It's really amazing what you guys do. My last question is, I think just naturally, obviously there are ideologies and viewpoints that should be seen as awful, should be seen as distinct, awful for society, that we shouldn't accept, like paedophilia, for example. Obviously, I'm not comparing turfs to paedophiles, but just naturally throughout history, we've had, previously it was like a conservative backlash, like Mary Whitehouse, for example. Do you think there is a role maybe for a societal censorship in terms of freedom of speech, and how is that different from an era like Mary Whitehouse? What do you think the natural line should be of what speech we should find agreeable or okay, and speech that we shouldn't?
Yeah, well, I like the phrase "sticks and stones may hurt my bones, but words will never hurt me." There are obviously things the Free Speech Union wouldn't defend, and I don't think should be defended in any democratic society. We wouldn't defend libel. We don't think that libel should be protected by the right to free speech. We wouldn't defend betraying state secrets. We certainly wouldn't defend child pornography. And I think beyond those obvious limits, we wouldn't defend people who've said something that's likely to lead to violence. That's the old English common law breach of the peace principle, that provided what you say within the limits I've just set out isn't going to cause a breach of the peace, or doesn't cause a breach of the peace, then you should be permitted to say it. I don't think that words having a hurtful psychological impact on people should be a good reason for banning them. I think you have to be able to show that they're going to lead to imminent, or what the Supreme Court called in the famous Brandenburg versus Ohio case, imminent lawless action, which is American for breach of the peace. But beyond that, if it's not going to lead to imminent lawless action, if it's not going to lead to a breach of the peace, then it should be permitted. And people have to, be a bit less precious and fragile about hurty words, which they say make them psychologically traumatized. I don't think protecting them from hearing those words is going to make them any more resilient. They have to learn how to cope with challenge, and even hearing some things they find offensive. We've gone far too far down the kind of safetiest route and away from the freedom route, and we need to rebalance that.
Well, amazing. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been amazing to speak to you.
Great to meet you.